In this video, we'll reveal what life on the Oregon Trail was really like. Far from a romantic journey, it was a dirty, disease-ridden road that tested every traveler. You'll learn about the constant dust, harsh weather, and daily struggles that made each mile more dangerous than the last. Number 1. The Overstuffed Prairie Schooners. Traveling the Oregon Trail meant loading every vital possession onto cramped wagons that pioneers typically called Prairie Schooners. They were around 4 feet wide and about 10 to 14 feet long, designed to be compact and sturdy, yet they were often filled beyond capacity. Furniture, bedding, pots, tools, flour barrels, rifles, and personal keepsakes were crammed inside, leaving little room to maneuver. The mere act of organizing these wagons was stressful. Families had to decide which heirloom quilts or cast iron skillets were worth hauling thousands of miles across hostile terrain. Those who had dreams of comfort discovered they needed to abandon rocking chairs and fancy trunks on the roadside to lighten the load. Since every extra pound slowed the oxen, families tended to argue about how many sacks of flour or how many changes of clothing should be brought along. Children squeezed into corners, sometimes forced to walk alongside for hours to spare the animals. Oxen, mules, or horses pulled these wagons day after day, raising thick clouds of dust that coated everything and everyone. Hooves pounded the ground with a dull thunder, and the wagon wheels themselves often needed repairs due to rocks and ruts. If an axle broke, the entire caravan might halt for half a day while someone with minimal carpentry skills tried to fix it. People quickly realized that space inside the wagon was more precious than gold. Personal items that seemed indispensable back in the East suddenly became dead weight. Frying pans, extra boots, and large musical instruments were sometimes jettisoned. Arguments would erupt. "We can't survive without that water barrel," or "that chest of books is going to break a wheel." Women who treasured certain keepsakes had to defend them. Fights about wagon load distribution were frequent, and families learned fast that the punishing environment didn't care about sentimental attachments. In this claustrophobic setting, filth and clutter seemed inevitable. Occasionally, someone would try to tidy up, but the next deep rut or the next day's journey would scatter everything inside once again. By the time they reached the Rockies, most wagons were battered, squeaky, and nearly stripped down to essentials like flour sacks, bedding, and a single trunk for valuables. Yet these vehicles were lifelines, offering the only semblance of shelter in an environment that promised scorching heat by day and biting cold at night. Number 2, filthy realities of constant travel. Mile after mile of dusty trails left a thin coat of dirt on skin, hair, and clothing. Bathing opportunities were limited, mostly tied to encountering a creek or river that wasn't dangerously high or contaminated. When water was scarce, entire families might go 2 weeks or more without a thorough wash. Even if they reached a clean stream, privacy was nearly impossible. Men, women, and children had to set up temporary bathing spots under blankets or wait until nightfall. Clothes were seldom properly laundered, as soap was a cherished commodity and spare water could not be wasted. Dirty garments were shaken, aired out, and worn again. Body odor and unwashed hair became the norm. Lice, fleas, and other pests thrived in such conditions. Makeshift tents were prone to infestations. Wagons themselves provided dark corners where insects could hide. Even the animals added layers of filth. Oxen, mules, and horses left manure everywhere, and flies buzzed relentlessly around camp. Disease spread easily under these circumstances, with filthy hands preparing food, unclean pots used for cooking, and contaminated surfaces serving as accidental breeding grounds for bacteria. At many stops, travelers tried to maintain at least minimal hygiene standards, perhaps scraping off mud from boots or hanging clothes in the sun. But the next stretch of trail negated those efforts quickly. The wind whipped up dirt that stuck to sweaty faces and layered inside cooking pots. Children frolicked in dust piles, raising clouds that settled onto open bowls of beans. Bodies stiffened from days of unrelenting jostling, making even small tasks seem tedious. People became resigned to grime, that sticky feeling that never quite went away, that gritty taste in every meal, that itching from bug bites. Nevertheless, despite the disgusting conditions, they trudged onward because the lure of land, a fresh start, or gold overshadowed any concerns about personal comfort. Filth, as unpleasant as it was, became a sign of progress. Every stain testified that they were further along, closer to that dream of the American Old West, and hopefully leaving behind the constraints of their old lives in exchange for a chance at freedom. Number 3, disease, death, and dread. Cholera, dysentery, smallpox, measles. Illnesses were relentless adversaries on the Oregon Trail. The waterborne hazards of cholera loomed large, especially along still or contaminated water sources. When wagon trains stopped for the night, they did not realize that upstream another group may have disposed of waste, turning the stream into a hazardous potion. Even livestock that slogged through the river kicked up bacteria-laden silt. Once cholera struck, it often advanced quickly, taking a victim from vibrant to lifeless in hours. Dysentery likewise sapped energy and caused severe dehydration. Without proper rest or medical knowledge, many succumbed to such maladies. Fear of contracting these diseases haunted each camp. Mothers worried endlessly about their children playing near muddy pools. Neighbors kept a wary eye on anyone showing symptoms of fever or diarrhea. Makeshift quarantine measures sometimes emerged, where ailing individuals were isolated in a separate wagon. But a real cure was elusive. Castor oil might alleviate dysentery, yet cholera frequently defied all attempts at healing. The constant movement exacerbated every ailment. A person weakened by fever could not simply stay in bed. The caravan had to push forward. Dust and scorching sun punished those with persistent coughs or open sores. Nighttime brought a damp chill, risking pneumonia. Then there were accidents, wagon wheels that rolled over legs, gun mishaps when cleaning rifles by the fire, stampedes triggered by spooked oxen. With no quick route to a doctor, a severe injury often proved fatal. Burials were heartbreakingly frequent. Many families placed loved ones in shallow graves, marking them with makeshift crosses or cairns before moving on. In the face of these losses, the sense of dread grew. Families that had left home brimming with optimism found themselves drained by sorrow. Children who once played along the trail learned the weight of mortality much too young. Nevertheless, the living had no choice but to continue. This was, after all, the promise of the Wild West, a land of enormous opportunity but equally immense peril. Every new sunrise offered hope of reaching the next fort or outpost where they might restock supplies and gather helpful remedies from traveling doctors. But that hope always had a shadow. What if the next bend in the trail meant another outbreak or another deadly mishap? Number 4, contaminated water and dwindling supplies. Access to fresh, uncontaminated water was never guaranteed. Streams in the plains might be brackish or muddy. Rivers fed by snowmelt in the mountains ran high and swift, making for dangerous crossings. Pioneers had to be strategic in their water usage. A full barrel of drinkable water was more precious than any trinket. Boiling water was advised by some, but not everyone had the resources, patience, or knowledge to do so consistently. When supplies began to dwindle, hunger took hold. Though some travelers, especially those with hunting skills, managed to shoot game like deer or bison, many lacked the means or time to do so regularly. Flour rations grew moldy if not properly sealed. Bacon spoiled in hot wagons if the salt brine evaporated. Butter quickly turned rancid. Consequently, families resorted to repetitive meals of dried bread or aged jerky. They worried about their nutritional intake, yet there was little choice. Stopping to forage for berries or gather edible plants was risky, as it delayed the caravan and might expose them to predators or outlaws. Trading posts existed at certain forts, but they marked only occasional respites. Prices could be high, and not every pioneer had spare cash. In desperate moments, some parted with heirloom jewelry or even family Bibles to buy much-needed flour or coffee. Under such hardship, many discovered that poor sanitation often intertwined with food scarcity. Cooking with unclean utensils risked contamination. Washing dishes thoroughly was impossible with limited water. Livestock that had traveled for weeks on end were themselves susceptible to disease, making their milk or meat questionable if they showed any sign of infection. Even attempts at preserving meat could go awry if the salt supply ran low. As the journey wore on, families adapted. They rationed coffee meticulously, cut portions in half, and stretched out meals by adding more water to soups. They also leaned on cooperation. Neighbors would barter, share leftover beans, or a haunch of game. In some circumstances, Native American tribes provided guidance on local plants and fishing areas, helping migrants survive. The challenge was balancing speed with survival. Pushing on too fast might lead to accidents or starvation, but lingering too long risked winter snows in the mountains or possible raids from Old West outlaws seeking easy targets. Number 5, land grants, opportunity, and lawlessness. The promise of vast land allotments in Oregon Territory or big strikes in California's goldfields lured thousands. Word of government incentives, such as the Oregon Donation Land Act, echoed across the East, painting glowing pictures of prosperity. Broadsides and newspapers proclaimed that the West was a paradise for enterprising souls. Reality proved more complicated. Even if a family reached fertile land, building a homestead required lumber, fencing, and farming knowledge. Meanwhile, the region's minimal law enforcement gave rise to conflicts over property lines. Some unscrupulous travelers staked claims near rivers or forests, then fled once they realized the land was not as fruitful as rumored. Others squabbled violently over water rights. This environment offered outlaws a golden opportunity to thrive. Away from established cities, bandits could ambush small groups on remote stretches of the trail. Stories circulated of cattle rustlers or horse thieves who attacked wagons at night. Rumors grew that certain roving gangs used stolen cattle to feed entire outlaw communities in hidden canyons. Lawman and vigilante groups occasionally formed to patrol known trouble spots, but with scarce manpower, they could not protect every weary traveler. Tension spilled over when individuals took justice into their own hands. Many frontier towns operated on a precarious system of improvised governance. Sheriffs were often men who'd migrated from the East or from Texas with minimal training in policing. They improvised, sometimes delivering swift justice with a bullet rather than a courtroom. Vigilantes hanged thieves from makeshift gallows. In that chaotic atmosphere, you might see a sign in some rough settlement proclaiming "Lawman for hire" or "Wanted outlaw, dead or alive." This raw form of law enforcement shaped the character of the American Old West, where illusions of freedom merged with the harsh realities of minimal state control. For many who traveled the Oregon Trail, the dream was not only farmland, but also a sense of independence from the rigid social systems back east. Yet that same independence attracted criminals who exploited the power vacuum. The absence of well-established law left settlers vulnerable, forging a precarious coexistence between hopeful homesteaders, roving cowboys, and unscrupulous characters ready to seize any opportunity for personal gain. Number 6. Weather havoc and terrifying terrain. The Oregon Trail traversed over 2,000 miles of diverse landscapes, rolling prairies, scorching deserts, rocky passes, and dense forests. Each region had its own climate-related hazards. Summers on the plains brought searing heat and dryness that cracked wagon wheels and withered livestock. Sudden thunderstorms could unleash floods or hailstones the size of marbles. The desert segments meant dealing with intense sun exposure and a drastic drop in nighttime temperatures that left travelers shivering around a meager campfire. Crossing rivers like the Platte or the Snake was perilous. Some used makeshift rafts or tried to ford on horseback. A single misstep could sweep wagons downstream, drowning people and animals. Quicksand also existed in some riverbeds, catching travelers by surprise. Rainstorms turned dirt tracks into muddy quagmires, bogging down heavy wagons for days. Meanwhile, crossing the high passes in the Rockies forced migrants to contend with altitude sickness and unexpected snowstorms, even in late spring. Horses and oxen struggled for footing on steep slopes. One miscalculated turn, and an entire wagon might topple into a ravine. Participants in this journey learned to dread the howling wind of mountain storms that threatened to blow away canvas covers or freeze unprotected travelers overnight. These weather extremes took a toll on morale. People often huddled in leaky tents or inside wagons, damp clothes clinging to their skin. Rotting footwear, frigid nights, and scorching midday sun tested them relentlessly. Children, especially, suffered from exposure and could develop life-threatening fevers. The unrelenting changes in climate also escalated scurvy if fresh produce was unavailable for weeks. Even after the immediate threat of a storm passed, the aftermath lingered. Wet supplies molded, wagons sank into rutted tracks, and swollen rivers delayed progress. Tempers flared as groups argued about whether to wait out the storm or push onward. Some parted ways, believing a different route promised better conditions. These divisions left smaller clusters more vulnerable to wildlife attacks or outlaw ambushes. Through each trial, however, the promise of farmland or gold spurred them forward. People consoled themselves by whispering that if they could survive this chaos, they could handle anything the Old West threw at them. Such were the grim realities of forging across that vast, unpredictable tapestry of land. Number 7. Outlaws, lawmen, and frontier crime waves. Many travelers blamed heightened bandit activity on the chaotic conditions of the trail. Law was slow to catch up with the massive influx of people heading west, so outlaws seized their chance. Small groups of bandits sometimes preyed on solitary families, stealing livestock or forcing them to hand over valuables. Tales spread of gangs that targeted newly arrived settlers near the Willamette Valley, assaulting those too weak to defend themselves after months on the trail. In some more organized settlements, self-appointed lawmen tried to impose order. Embodying a rough brand of frontier justice, these individuals formed posses to track down suspected criminals. The typical confrontation concluded with an exchange of gunfire, and if an outlaw was captured, it was not unusual to see a quick makeshift trial. Hangings or floggings were doled out with minimal due process, reflecting the raw reality of the Old West. Meanwhile, renegade cowboys roamed from ranch to ranch, sometimes stirring up trouble. They might steal horses or challenge a local rancher's authority. Those who faced accusations of rustling could find themselves at odds with both official lawmen and vigilante mobs. The line between lawful cowboy and trigger-happy outlaw blurred when lucrative bounties were at stake. Eager bounty hunters prowled the region, spurred on by the promise of quick money. They pinned wanted posters to posts, offering rewards for capturing or killing notorious bandits. Some had no scruples about setting traps or delivering vigilante justice for a cut of the reward. Innocent travelers occasionally became collateral damage if they stumbled into an active pursuit. Old West outlaws with names that still echo in modern stories. though more often associated with Texas or Arizona, occasionally ventured near the Oregon Trail. Rumors that Jesse James or Billy the Kid might appear here were largely unfounded fantasies. Nevertheless, locals whispered about lesser-known criminals who set up base in remote gullies, waiting to rob unsuspecting wagons. This undercurrent of lawlessness added another layer of anxiety for travelers. Disease and weather were formidable enough, but bandits introduced a human threat. Families devised security measures, including night watches and traveling in caravans large enough to discourage attacks. A rotating guard system helped, with riflemen posted around camp. While not every group encountered violent crime, the fear of it kept people wary, always scanning the horizon for suspicious riders or hidden silhouettes. In this dynamic environment, those determined to forge new lives learned to be cautious and, in some cases, armed to the teeth. Number 8. Native American perspectives and cultural exchange. The Oregon Trail cut through lands inhabited by numerous Native American tribes, including the Sioux, Shoshone, Umatilla, and Cayuse. Popular lore in the East often painted these peoples as aggressors, fueling fear among emigrants that they would face constant attacks. However, many interactions were peaceful and involved trade, guidance, and sharing knowledge about the region's resources. Pioneers might exchange blankets or knives for fresh vegetables, dried fish, or horses. Native guides sometimes assisted wagon trains in locating safer river crossings or finding passable trails through the mountains. These moments of cooperation often proved pivotal to survival, given the harshness of the environment. Nevertheless, tensions did exist. Some tribes were alarmed by the influx of settlers who trampled grazing fields, depleted game, and contaminated water sources. Overgrazing by immigrant livestock threatened the balance that indigenous communities had maintained for generations. Although many tribes initially tried to negotiate or levy tolls for passing through their territory, misunderstandings frequently arose. Cultural differences in property ownership and communication added to the strain. Moreover, the presence of unscrupulous travelers who might cheat or harm native inhabitants fueled resentment. Skirmishes erupted when wagon trains mistakenly believed they were under attack, or when young warriors tested the newcomers' resolve. Raiders among both settlers and indigenous groups sometimes stole livestock, escalating violence. Frontier lawmen were rarely present to mediate these disputes, leaving vigilante actions or tribal retaliations as the primary recourse. White settlers often underreported or distorted these incidents in letters and diaries, causing sensational tales of massacres to spread across the East. Meanwhile, indigenous voices detailing forced displacement and broken treaties were mostly ignored. Despite periodic conflicts, many travelers discovered that genuine dialogue could be mutually beneficial. Assistance from native guides was invaluable, especially in bleak winter conditions. The tribe's expertise in local flora saved some wagon trains from starvation. Some families were indebted to indigenous healers who used traditional medicine to treat injuries or illnesses. This dynamic interplay shaped an evolving narrative about the frontier. Over time, the unstoppable tide of settlement displaced many tribes entirely as official policies and land grabs escalated. The Oregon Trail became not only a route of promise, but also a route of cultural upheaval, as Native Americans struggled to preserve their way of life under the relentless push of westward expansion. Number 9. Women's fortitude and hidden challenges. Women on the Oregon Trail carried responsibilities that went beyond household chores. They cooked in dusty campsites and tried to keep children safe while also driving teams of oxen when men fell ill. Many diaries reveal their resilience in the face of adversity, yet these accounts also expose their emotional burden. Leaving extended families behind in the East was traumatic enough, but constant threats on the trail intensified the strain. Childbirth in a cramped wagon was particularly dangerous. With no trained midwife available in most traveling parties, complications could become life-threatening. The mother might remain on the wagon floor for days, recovering as the caravan continued to roll. Neighbors would assist, but everyone was exhausted. Women also faced social expectations. They were expected to maintain a semblance of civilized behavior in lawless surroundings. Washing clothes, even if the water was limited, was partly a moral duty to keep the family presentable. Some tried to uphold Victorian-era standards of modesty, wearing long dresses that easily collected grime and snagged on wagon wheels. They coped with monthly cycles in an era with no modern sanitary supplies. Meanwhile, they lived with the fear of potential violence from outlaws or the unknown. Despite these hardships, women adapted. They dried fruit over campfires, bartered recipes with neighbors, and found ways to gather herbs for makeshift medicines. They formed support networks, swapping tips on how to patch wagon covers or treat cholera symptoms using homemade remedies. Sometimes, they even took up arms in emergencies, defending their loved ones against wolves or threatening strangers. Their perseverance subtly challenged prevailing attitudes about female fragility. Some accounts note that when men were incapacitated, wives or daughters would steer the wagon train. When nearing larger outposts, a resourceful woman might trade crocheted blankets for fresh vegetables or eggs. Though rarely recognized for their leadership, their organizational skills often kept entire groups afloat. Their diaries, if they survived the journey, remain crucial for modern historians studying the American Old West, since they offer an unvarnished view of daily life, unfiltered by the male-dominated narratives of gunslingers and lawmen. Through fatigue and frequent danger, women stood as pillars of strength that helped keep families united and determined to reach Oregon or California. Their role highlights an aspect of frontier life often overshadowed by cowboy legends and sensational stories of Old West outlaws. Number 10. Overland tales that shaped the Old West legacy. Rumors, legends, and tall tales grew like wild weeds in campfire circles. Stories of hidden gold veins or half-crazed outlaws roamed the wagon trains faster than actual news. Some claimed they heard of entire caravans wiped out by vengeful Native Americans. Others said a family struck gold simply by digging near a riverbank. These narratives had a life of their own, inspiring hope or terror. The intangible power of myth was palpable. One day, you might hear that an outlaw band led by a former lawman had holed up in an abandoned fort, robbing travelers passing near the Snake River. Another rumor might warn about a ghostly pioneer woman searching the plains for her lost children. Folks would whisper these stories around the fire, half believing, half skeptical. Despite their questionable origins, such anecdotes colored the psychological landscape. They fueled caution, superstition, and sometimes reckless bravery. Children clung to the edges of blankets, wide-eyed at mentions of heroic cowboys battling sinister gangs under a blazing western sun. Over time, these overland myths expanded into the broader tapestry of the American Old West. Newspapers back east seized on sensational details, and dime novel writers wove lurid tales that blurred the line between fact and fiction. The real experiences of disease, exhaustion, and raw survival were sometimes overshadowed by dramatized accounts of gunfights and untamed lawlessness. Yet the genuine hardships endured by Oregon Trail travelers ultimately influenced how towns developed. Settlement patterns formed around safer routes, trading posts, and defensive positions. The overshadowed chapters about filth, hunger, and heartbreak subtly blended into the story of how frontier communities took shape.